Hi, I'm Paul Marcel. In this episode of Angle Madness, we're going to put a finish on these Burl panels. These need to be finished before being installed into their boxes, their drawer tiers. So we're going to walk through sort of some color selection, some different things that you can do with the colors as far as blotch control, some unusual ways of doing blotch control, and then taking it all the way up through putting a polyacrylic finish on there and then getting it to a pretty high gloss. Now, I originally intended on making this episode one that we would take care of the color on the panels, glue the panels in, and then I would sand to shape the box and put the finish on the boxes. Now, in this episode, we'll talk about the finish for the boxes, but I won't actually be putting it on because I need to do something to this panel before we glue it in. Now, back in the original design episode, I mentioned that it would be really nice if in the back of the panels we could make like a trap door so that I could gather up the wires and push them into the column so you would never see them from the front or even from the side without really peering into the back. But I left that until later because there were enough little variables involved that I wasn't sure. It's like, I'll do it if I can. If I can't, well, no problem. But I did a lot of experimenting, and there's a way that we can do a really nice job of putting one here in the back, and they'll have some nice rounded shapes in the back. So that'll be the next episode where we're actually going to be doing some wire inlay stuff and all that craziness. So for this episode, just to finish on the panels. Now before we get into the episode, during part of the processing of this panel, I did some wet sanding both to flatten the panel and to set a sheen. At that time, I was targeting a satin sheen because I thought that's what I really wanted. When I was finished with it, I put the panels basically up against a wall and realized that I could actually go for a higher gloss because there's never going to be a light source behind it coming through and giving you that kind of overly glary surface that you can sometimes get with gloss. So I ended up deciding to take it up to gloss. So you'll hear that thing about satin, and then we'll get right into doing a polish to get it up to this nice shiny surface. So fair warning, it's all finishing in this episode. So if you're not really into the finishing thing, there's probably a lot of videos up on the side of the list here that you could punch. Some of them are going to have some thumbnails that are going to indicate something that is never going to be shown in the video, but you can hit the button anyway. So my day job has kept me out of the shop here for the last 3-4 months, so that hasn't been any fun, but at least I did sneak in occasionally, and I was working on a finish board. So here's a board of finishes for me to consider for the top burl for these panels. Now for testing out a single die over several different preconditioners, I just partitioned out the strips. So these first 3 strips were actually divided up into 4 quadrants. Really easy with a 4-way book match. So the first quadrant here was considered dry. It didn't have any preconditioner whatsoever, just the burl, apply the dye. Now these other quadrants on this side were treated with Charles Neal's blotch control. Now the side here had 2 coats, whereas the other side had a single coat. Now if you're not familiar with Charles Neal's blotch control, it's a water-based product, goes on very easily. When you apply it to solid wood or veneers, what it will do is it'll seal off the parts that would normally blotch. Now the 4th quadrant is an interesting preconditioner. Since all these dyes are water-based, all I did is I used water. On that section, I would flood it with some water, let it stand for a bit, wipe off the excess, and immediately apply the dye or the stain. The idea being that all those super absorbent areas that would blotch would absorb all the water, and then I would apply an even amount of stain over the top, and then as it all settles in, I would get even consistent color. And it's surprising how well it worked, especially on some dyes and stains. A couple other ones it failed miserably, so testing is important. Now I really like this New England maple that Charles Neal had a formula for, so I tried that out, and I tried 2 different application methods. So I kind of burned these 2 panels right away over here. And then I started chopping them up more, realizing I needed more room for testing. So I really like this one. It looks good on his projects, which are generally in cherry. This being on maple burl, it seems like it's just far too red. So it's too red, especially for where I'll be placing it. So I kind of eliminated this, but there are some things I liked about it. So over here, I tried a number of other dyes. I applied light brown here and here so that I could try the 4 undercoats, and then pecan and golden oak. Now, it just not really going over each of these, but just to point out that with this light brown, you can really see the difference that the Charles Neal blotch control did over here. You see a lot of clarity, a lot of clear spots, and then you see the burl. It's all very well defined. Whereas over here, where there was no preconditioner or where there was a water preconditioner, you can just see a lot of blotching where the grain that you were trying to accent just became so dark that it's distracting. So while the browns were nice, I was still really eager to get a little bit more of this maple color in, especially with some of the ambers. So here I was playing with a number of different experiments, pulling things from both of these panels to see what I liked. Now, one thing that's an interesting thing I did on this panel here is this strip in the back and then the strip in the front. So again, the 4 different types of undercoat. Before I applied the dye, I applied Silicel. So in effect, I technically was applying the dye as a glaze because it was over a finish. But what's interesting is that the clarity is fantastic. So this one here is over dry with just the Silicel, and you can see that it's got some excellent clarity. There was a little bit of blotching in the case where I applied the Silicel over water. Now that sounds like an odd thing, but it was something that I picked up from Charles Neal, that occasionally you can use water as a blotch control even if you're going to be applying an oil. It doesn't affect any of the adhesion. And then I left this large square here to be kind of my final. When I decided I wanted to apply it there to have a little bit bigger postage stamp to look at. So that one there has Silicel applied, followed by the dye I was going to use, which is Antique Cherry with a little bit of extra amber added to it. And that seems to add just enough red and just enough amber to it that I like it. It's a little tricky because where this is going is up against a red wall. So that'll be the finish that we'll be applying on the Burl. Now in the case of water-based dyes, when you apply them, they look great. That's kind of the look that you're going to get once you get a top coat on them. But once they dry, they look really blah. So I've applied a top coat to all of this except this last little section here. So now I also did some experiments on what I could do to the outside case. I took a board, one of the offcuts of this project itself. I mean, it was one of the ones that was kind of ugly with a streak on it, but had plenty of tiger striping, and I simply resawed it so that I would end up having 10 surfaces to do some experiments with. Now, at the time of doing all this, I had just received Charles Neal's Finishing Simply Put book. Now, I did a review of this on my blog. Short version, get it. This is a lot of the things that he does in different situations to fix things, for coloring, how things work. There's no formulas in here, there's no recipes, but also at the same time there's no real chemistry in there. You're not going to learn about how a varnish cross-links or bonds to wood or anything like that. So it's a very practical book. Now I've been following Charles for a long time, so I can easily say everything I've learned about finishing, I learned from him. So this book is great because in a way all those things from different sources is all in one place now. Plus he's added a number of new articles in there on things that I hadn't ever heard him talk about. Because I was looking at this, I decided to give him a call and ask him what I could do for this outside case. Now, if you remember, the whole design is based off of a diamond. So I really would like to keep this white because you don't really see a lot of brown diamonds, and if you got a brown diamond, you probably don't really like the girl you're giving it to. So with the design, we have those shiny aluminum rods coming off of over here, as well as we have a wire inlay that's going to be going along here. So every edge has a little bit of a shine point to it, just like a refraction point would be in a diamond. So I really wanted to keep the outside case white, but I do want to accent the tiger striping. So I presented that to Charles. He thought about it for a while, and then he came back with something that's not in any of the books or DVDs. So the guy's got just too many finishing ideas in his head. And one of these ideas was one that he wasn't even sure. He's never done it, but he thought, hey, it might work. So I tried it, and it works pretty well. In his book, he observed that the Formsby tongue oil is about as close as you can get to a water-clear oil for a solvent-based finish. So it doesn't add a lot of color. So he's suggesting that that would really work if I want to keep it white. But he's not so sure if I would get a lot of the tiger stripe chatoyance that we want. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have something like boiled linseed oil. Tends to add a fair amount of amber, almost more than anything else, but it does really accent the chatoyance. That's one reason why people like it so much. The only bad part is for a person like him who does things in production is that boiled linseed oil takes forever and a day to dry. So the suggestion to me was to flood the case with boiled linseed oil, give it a little bit of time to soak in, and then wipe it dry as hard as I could. So the idea being let the boiled linseed oil get deep into the tiger striping and then wipe it off so that the flat parts wouldn't have very much of an effect. Give it a chance to dry, and then hit it with some sandpaper to sand it off. Basically, get down below where some of it could have soaked in between the stripes, and then hit the whole case with the Formsby, where it won't really add much color. So I tried that out on one of these boards. Now this board here has that schedule on it, and you can see that there is some amber because of the boiled linseed oil. I also wasn't real aggressive about the sanding. This one here has just the Formsby on it, and you can definitely see that it's not as amber. Maybe not so much on the camera. Now the thing that was interesting is I was looking at these two going, well, the Formsby and this harder schedule, they both actually look kind of similar except for the little bit of amber, which honestly I could do without. So maybe it's not worth the trouble of going through all these extra steps. But then when I'm looking at it, the chatoyance is about the same. So then I decided to stick it actually on the cabinet. So this is just a Formsby. When I stick it on the side of the cabinet, so this is the angle I'll be viewing it at. When I'm looking at it, sure I can see the tiger striping. It doesn't really bounce out at me that much. It doesn't really have that chatoyance that you'd normally really like. So then I stuck the one that has his schedule. And when I put it on there, oh, the tiger striping is there, and also the chatoyance is really there. It really is a big difference between the two that I don't see when I'm looking at it straight on. So I've always known that you're really supposed to evaluate chatoyance, in situ. You don't want to just assume it's going to work. In this case here, it really made a difference in choosing between the finishes. All right, well, I didn't want to bore you to death with finishing, but I had to explain a little bit of how we got here for it, because I know a lot of people have that go-to finish that they use on everything and even brush their teeth on it with in the morning. Now, I did come up with an anecdotal story about boiled linseed oil along the way while doing these experiments. So this can here is a can that I purchased about 3 months ago when I was doing all these experiments. Yeah, it's been that long. This is a can that I have that, best I can tell, is about 17 years old. So when my dad passed, I cleaned out his storage shed and I found this quart container of boiled linseed oil along with a big gallon container. Now, best I can tell, it was for refinishing a gate. So I have a feeling he had a little extra. Now, the interesting thing was, I tried this, and goes on nicely, adds the color that you normally expect. Dried very reasonably, pretty quickly, almost as fast as, say, Armor Seal. But I had always heard it takes forever and a day to dry, so I bought a new one, and I applied this. This one took forever and a day to dry. So when I talked to Charles Neal, I mentioned that to him, and he was saying, oh yeah, in the past it was great because the stuff was actually boiled, so it would actually cure in a reasonable amount of time. Now they just take linseed oil and hit it with a bunch of metal dryers, and then they sell it as boiled linseed oil because that's sort of the product name for what it is. So this has never really been boiled. At least that's best that we can tell, and that's the difference between the two. So I'm lucky that I have old stock boiled linseed oil, and that's what I'm going to be using on this case because it'll make my life a whole lot easier. All right, well, it's not going to finish itself on its own, so let's get going. So a quick interlude to explain a repair I had to do to this one particular panel. Now the problem with the panel was that I ended up getting 3 dimples in it. Now that's because I used this ridiculously high quality sign board that I've been struggling with ever since I made that bad decision. Don't ever do that. Don't. You can't fix it with the Bondo and nursing it. It's too much time. But I could make this repair pretty easily, so I thought I would show you. Now, where the quarters are located were where the 3 dimples were located. They were the same diameter actually as the quarters, and 2 of them were about a 1/16 of an inch deep, and the third one almost an 1/8 of an inch. So, relatively speaking, fairly big. Now I should have filmed this before, during, and after the repair, but you're just getting the after now. So take a look. With the raking light that I have over there, you should be seeing those 3 dimples appearing and disappearing. They're right above where my fingers are located. Now granted, this has 3 coats of polyacrylic on it. It's been sanded to 600 grit. There's going to be a couple more coats to smooth it. This part here does look rough, so you might see a little bit of roughness because I haven't flattened the repair yet. So how does this repair work? You want to fill this with something that's clear so that you can get this whole surface flat. That of course makes it that nobody feels the dimple. But also the benefit of that is that with that there, it's going to bring the light and the colors and everything, it's going to kind of bring that up to the surface. It gets rid of the shadow. The shadow is what you're seeing. With this board located here before I did the repair, I could walk into my shop and without any effort at all, I could easily spot the 3 dimples. So by getting rid of it so that there is no shadow anymore, now I can't really see it other than just the sort of mess because I haven't sanded it yet. So the trick for doing this is using Aquacoat Clear Grain Filler. It should say clear in there, but it doesn't. There's two types. There's natural and clear. So if it says natural, that's not the one you want. You want the one that says clear. And even though it says clear, it's still going to look like yellow mayonnaise. All I did, took a little spatula, loaded some up, put them in the holes, and kind of ground it with the spatula, mostly trying to flatten out any lumps that are in there just because it needs to get mixed pretty well. Once it was nice and smooth, smoothed it over the holes, and then I took this card to basically screed over it. By dragging it over, it left just the right amount in the holes. Now, I knew this was going to shrink, and the holes are relatively big, so I took the excess and kind of made a little lump where I could tell the deep part is. Now, when I came back in later and it had all nicely dried, I could see that the larger one, the 1/8 inch deep one, had still a little depression. So I threw a little bit more in, and it looks great. So now all I need to do is I'm going to take a block that has some 600 grit paper on it. Just going to go across until I level it with the rest. Once I get the scratches going evenly across it, I'll be fine. And then I can continue my finishing schedule on here, adding a couple more coats of polyacrylic. Now, this is a water-based product, so if I take polyacrylic and I were to brush it on, technically the water of the polyacrylic can soften this Aquacoat, and that could cause problems. So a safe thing to do is just give it a real light spritz of the shellac on there first before you put that next coat on, and you'll be just fine. You'll also be just fine if you don't sit there and work it with the brush. So it's an excellent way of repairing things. I've repaired a lot of things with this. Now, while we're talking about repair, I guess I should point out one other thing. One of these had, sort of a little knot in the burl, and the little section popped out during the vacuum pressing. Not a big deal. I just took some Familwood wood filler. This walnut colored one is perfect when you're trying to match like a burl knot that pops out. So this was really easy to use. All right, off to sanding and more coats. So I just finished spraying 5 coats of General Finishes polyacrylic on all the panels. I just took a Fuji HVLP to lay on some good coats. Now, one thing I noticed, I posted some photos on my Facebook page to other woodworkers, and a couple people commented that, ooh, too bad it's got so much orange peel, because it looks really thick when you first spray that on. It looks like watered down white Elmer's glue. But that's actually the look that you want. That's the type of coat that you need. So you need it to be kind of foggy everywhere with that, and then it'll settle out very quickly. About a half hour later, you'll start seeing clarity all over the place, and then it flows beautifully. Now, what I want to do here is I want to wet sand this, and I'm going to use some platen papers. So these go from 500 to 4,000 grit, and they're nice and spongy, so they're going to ride on here nicely. Now, they don't have holes in them, of course, because you don't use a vac with it. You're just going to be wet sanding in place. Now, Festool makes these platen papers. There's also other brands also make these. If you can get these at automotive supply places where you can get this for wet sanding your car and such. I believe these are Mirka Gold, I'm not sure. So the 500 is the one where we're going to do, in a way, the most work. What I want to do with this is I want to make sure that everything gets scratched and gets scratched evenly. There are going to be little places where there's like a minor divot. So part of the problem is that I had to process all these in 113 degree weather in a 90 degree shop that was used for drying, is that the finish never really got a chance to flow out as much as it normally would. So there are some places where there's just a minor divot. Basically, I can go over it with all the sandpaper and you'll just see in a raking light little dots that are shiny. I want to make sure I go over it until I have none of those. So an advantage of using the abrasives to accomplish this is that it's now perfectly smooth just because I sanded the top. So the whole top is nice and level, everything has been brought down, and then I get the sheen that I want with the final grit that I'm on, as opposed to, say, using certain coats of gloss and then some satin coats or something like that. You're still going to have to sand it to flatten that, and then now you have two different things competing for the sheen. You have the flatteners that are in the finish, and then you have the flatteners, in a sense, from the mechanical abrading. So I think that this is a little bit easier, and it makes it easier for me because I just buy polyacrylic by the gallon. Now there is a side story I wanted to put in here because it might help point out something that could happen to you. One thing I was doing is because I had a lot of other things going on in the shop, some classes I was taking, some other things I was doing as like a commission for somebody, is I took all the panels and I wrapped them all up and then I put them in the other side of the shop. I did that a couple times to get them out of here so they wouldn't get damaged. So I wrapped them up in this canvas, the same canvas that I use when I do the pressing of marquetry and when I did the veneer on these panels. Now what I noticed is that on one of my coats I put on, the top panel was just littered with little tiny fisheye. It was as if I took an eraser, a pencil eraser, and just dropped, oil or whatever anywhere to create these fisheyes everywhere. This panel here, which is the middle tier, it had fisheyes all around the outside. The bottom one didn't have any. Now, the way that I wrapped them up into that canvas was I took the bottom one and I put it face down onto here because I don't have enough canvas to wrap all three individually. So the canvas was touching the outside edge. And then the top was completely enveloped by the canvas, so it was completely covered. So those were the clues that pointed me that the canvas had something to do with it. Now, it's not the canvas per se that caused the fisheye. What it is because I use this in the vacuum bag, this is in contact with the inside of the vacuum bag, and those have glue release. So in effect, that canvas has some glue release on it from being in the vacuum bag, and then I transferred it over here, which caused the fisheye. So I ended up having to sand away, basically 2 coats to get through all that and then restart. So just keep that in mind before you grab random things. I'm going to use moving blankets in the future. So the panel's all colored and up to a nice high gloss. These are ready to go into the drawer tiers. They can be just glued right in. We can take care of sanding those boxes and then apply the finish schedule that we talked about earlier in the finish experiments. But since I've made a decision to make these little trap doors in the back of these panels that is going to be used for gathering the wires and pushing them into the columns, I need to take care of that first before they get glued into the boxes. So now these little trap doors are going to have a nice shape. They're going to be nice and curvy like this. They're not going to be out of MDF. So these are going to be in the middle of the field like this with the column coming in here, and then the doors actually kind of intercept the sides of the column, at least in theory. Now, while cutting out these little trap doors isn't all that complicated, it's complicated because I want to apply a wire inlay on the door itself. So there's a little bit more to it than just simply marking a line and going ahead and cutting to it. So we're going to take care of that in the next episode. So we'll address a few issues that have to do with the wire inlay. We won't go into the wire inlay in depth because I am going to produce a separate episode outside the series of Angle Madness that's going to be exclusively on the things I've been experimenting with on wire inlay. That will include how to do this wire inlay. So besides the trapdoor, of course, I have to have the column built in order to plan where it's going to go. So you'll see how the column got built. It's very, very easy to do. If you've been following along with all the other angles, the column is so easy by comparison. All right, we'll catch you in the next episode.